Can you see?
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, so just 1 second. Yeah, welcome everyone to this special webinar of integrative conservation. Yes, today we'll have a very special guest, and I think we'll have a very, very interesting discussion. But before I introduce Professor Sachs and the topic of his talk, just remind everyone that this is a special webinar that is done by Integrative Conservation. It's a new academic journal that we launched in December 2022. It's a journal based in Sichuan. So Professor Sachs, this is a small rural area in southwest China. We are just 40 kilometers away from Myanmar and 40 kilometers away from Laos. It's a lovely place, and you're very welcome to visit us at any time if you have the chance.
Wonderful.
So I will not take much time. I will just remind people that the next month, actually on the 4th of June, we have another webinar by Professor William Sutherland from Cambridge University. And I think, Professor Sachs, you have shared at least one paper with Bill, your Science 2009 paper. He was one of your co-authors. So then, without any further delay, just I will introduce Professor Sachs, which I think is very well known and doesn't need much introduction. He's a very well-known economics professor, as a best-selling author. He focused a lot on education. He's a global leader in opinion and particularly in sustainable development. He has been a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He spent, I think, around 20 years in Harvard. He was a special advisor to 3 different UN Secretary Generals, including the current one, Antonio Guterres. And I think he's best known, he's a macroeconomist focusing on sustainable development. And he's very well known for his role in the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we asked Professor Sachs to talk about sustainable development and conservation as part of our focus in integrative conservation. And the title of his presentation is Strengthening Global Cooperation for Biodiversity Conservation. So, Professor Sachs, do you have any slides, or you will just...
No, I'm just going to speak.
Fantastic. So then, okay.
Very good. Shall I begin?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you to everybody that is listening. I'm very delighted and honored to be with you. And I view this as a brainstorming opportunity for me, as well as I hope for you. I'm an economist. I'm not a conservation biologist or a specialist in your topic of integrative conservation. But I am working with the United Nations actively every day to try to implement the globally agreed goals that we have set for sustainable development. So I'm constantly wondering about and worrying about how we can actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. Now, the basic problem is that our institutional framework, our politics and our economic institutions are not aligned with sustainable development. They are not aligned with conservation. They are not aligned with stabilizing the climate. They are not aligned with protecting biodiversity. So we are in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has been underway for many decades. It's already more than 30 years since the world governments adopted 3 major environmental agreements. The first on climate change, the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And these were adopted back in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We are more than 30 years later, and not one of these treaties is actually being implemented successfully. The reasons are complex, but the basic problem is that the international market economy and our geopolitical environment, the way that governments interact, does not lead to success so far. Time is also very short, because when we're dealing with biological conservation or climate change, it's not only a matter of delay, it's a matter of irreversibilities that we are facing. If we drive species to extinction, as far as we know, we're not going to recover them. If we exceed climate limits, we are not easily going to recover a safe climate. In both circumstances of ecosystem functioning and of the climate, and they're obviously related, we believe that there are tipping points beyond which we experience highly dangerous feedback effects and runaway effects that become irreversible. So when I say that we have lost time during the last 30 years, it's not merely that we have delayed the introduction of effective measures. We have also come closer to major irreversibilities. In the case of biological diversity, these irreversibilities include species extinction and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. When it comes to climate change, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we have already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will probably exceed the 1.5 degrees limit in 2024. Now, partly this is because of a short-term or interannual effect of El Nino, but the underlying upward trend of global warming has definitely accelerated. And we are now at a warming rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees, perhaps very seriously. And that could lead to irreversible disasters. The destruction of the ice sheets, or at least part of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, the slowing or even stopping of the ocean circulation, the thermohaline circulation, the melting of permafrost and the massive release of methane and CO2 buried beneath the permafrost, and of course the loss of species that cannot migrate successfully in the context of a warming climate and which reach thermal limits beyond which they can't survive. And that's true of both plants and animals, and many alpine species which have been climbing up the mountainsides, but the mountains have peaks, and beyond that, the warming will lead to the destruction of the habitat of these species. In general, the world market economy does not send the right signals either for climate change or for biodiversity conservation. Markets do not incorporate the losses of natural capital in any direct way. These are, from an economic theory point of view, external effects that are not captured by market forces. And as much as we have discussed for the last 40 years, actually, these external effects, we have not succeeded in internalizing them or bringing them under control. Now, when it comes to biological diversity, I would say the challenge is even more complicated than the climate challenge. When it comes to the climate challenge, which includes the land use regulations, there is at least a pathway that can be identified for how the world's energy systems can be transformed in order to stop the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel use, and when it comes to the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at least a sketch of what needs to be done. When it comes to biological diversity, I would say that every biome, every ecosystem, every local land use environment presents its own challenges, which are very complex, which do not lend themselves to easy market-based solutions where one simply adjusts a market price, for example, and thereby creates an incentive that leads to the right outcomes. Because when we're talking about biological diversity, it's very hard to put a price on biological diversity. We don't easily correct the market failures that lead to the destruction of species and lead to the destruction of the functioning of the ecosystems. So when it comes to what to do, the challenges of biological conservation are extraordinarily complex. They cannot easily be summarized in the way that the climate agenda can be summarized. With the climate agenda, well, even there, of course, it's complex, but with the climate agenda, we say things like decarbonize the energy system by 2050, or reach net zero emissions by 2050. When we discuss the same issues with regard to biological diversity, we say protect a certain amount of land area, or stop or slow the destruction of habitat, or the extinction rates, and so on. But these are goals that are not easily turned into policies with effect. And so my own observation of these processes that I've been involved in a diplomatic level for the last 25 years on a daily basis is that both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda are complicated, but I would say the biodiversity agenda is even more complicated and less successful in terms of any kind of public awareness, set of policies, or measures of implementation. I think it's right to say we are on a path that is disastrous right now. In almost every part of the world, we have a massive destruction of ecosystem functions, a large loss of biodiversity, a sharp reduction typically in the relevant species or the number of members of species, so the species abundance is in decline, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forests or whether it's different classes of species, amphibians or pollinators or other groups. And we do not have effective mechanisms to address this decline that are actually working and operational. So what to do? My own approach, which I advocate for all issues, and I should say that when it comes to sustainable development, we're talking about not only the environmental crises, but also the social crises, the economic crises, the problems of extreme poverty. We have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, after all. We have the climate crisis and so forth. My own view is that we need much more detailed specification of our objectives, of the ways to achieve them, and of their incorporation into national plans on a scientific basis, and then the identification of the policy instruments, whether it is economic incentives, regulation, land use, protected areas and so forth for how the scientifically specified objectives can be achieved, and then a systematic and frequent monitoring mechanism so that we are not simply meeting every 5 or 10 years to understand how bad things are going, but actually reporting almost in real time using extensive satellite data and ground truthing data so that we have a rapid feedback of data to confirm or disconfirm whether we are on the right track, and to enable not only monitoring and understanding the state of affairs, but also enforcement mechanisms that typically mean enforcement against illegal actions like illegal fishing or illegal clearing of forests or illegal use of scarce fresh water supplies and so forth. So planning, incentive structures, and monitoring mechanisms are all essential. I know that in a sense this exists in the area of biological diversity because the Kunming-Montreal Protocol is supposed to do this, but it is extremely weak. I can go an entire year without hearing one policymaker or one ambassador or one finance minister even mention the Convention on Biological Diversity, much less discuss how it is being enforced or implemented or incentivized. I hear almost nothing about this agenda at the UN or among policy makers. So you are the scientists and the experts, but I can tell you it is not in the active domain of the policy community. Now, I do also need to stress that even the climate agenda, which is much more visible, is also not being implemented because, well, it raises a number of questions, which I'll mention briefly, but the biodiversity agenda is way down on the list of awareness, of priority, of budgets, and of specific mechanisms for implementation. And it's more complicated because there aren't simple rules of what to do. These policies need to be implemented with a tremendous local knowledge everywhere. So only local ecologists can save their own local ecosystems because outsiders don't know, don't care, and are not in a position to set policies and plans for success. One more basic point that I want to emphasize, and then I'll talk about a couple of the obstacles, and then we can open it up for discussion. Whether it is the climate agenda or whether it is the biodiversity agenda, regional cooperation between neighboring countries is typically essential. And everything that I've said about how hard this is involves another level of difficulty, which is active cooperation among neighboring countries. Governments do not work very well together in a detailed way on just about anything. But in the areas of shared biomes, a shared river system, a shared forestry, a shared fisheries, cooperation sometimes exists on paper, but in practice, it's quite limited. Usually in a rivershed, the upstream countries do what they want, and the downstream countries try to adjust to the consequences. When it comes to fisheries, the illegal fishing is pervasive. Fleets come in and they hope to avoid detection. They catch the fish and they leave. But enforcement is very weak. When it comes to shared forest regions, it is very hard to get agreements on a shared forest biome to limit deforestation or logging, especially of highly valued tropical forest products. And so regional cooperation is both vital and difficult. This is true also in the climate area on energy transformation. In general, a low carbon energy system requires interconnections across national borders because when it comes to intermittent energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro, it's better to connect those in a large grid to reduce the variability by smoothing across a number of different sources rather than having one country at a time make its own energy system. But getting that kind of regional grid requires a lot of political trust, a lot of market organization, a lot of shared regulation, and so on. All of this is made complicated by our geopolitical environment. The United States is a very bad behavior, in my view, right now. The US government is more interested in its power, its military advantage, its dominance, than it is in sustainable development. I almost never hear a constructive word coming out of Washington about these topics. The only thing Washington is interested in is war, the military, and competition with China and competition with Russia. And this is all extremely short-sighted and dangerous and nasty, I have to say. So the geopolitical environment is also extremely difficult. Now, finally, let me just say what a world should be doing. And when it comes to land use and biodiversity, let me emphasize a very basic point, which you know, which is that sustainable management of ecosystems is critical both for the climate goals as well as for the biodiversity goals, because around 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, deforestation, and unsustainable forms of agriculture. And so this means that if we're going to address the climate agenda, we intrinsically need to address the conservation agenda. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect the ecosystem functions because they not only contribute directly to the biodiversity objectives, but they also contribute to the climate objectives. And of course, they're fundamental for many other objectives as well, for public health, for example, for access to safe water supplies, and so on. So this agenda of sustainable land use, conservation, and ecosystem protection is a pervasive objective, but it is a difficult one. It's difficult scientifically, and it's very difficult to implement. The first thing that I have always wanted to see is a rigorous approach to land use planning that satisfies the needs of biological diversity conservation. My guru was the wonderful scientist Edward Wilson, who was a teacher of mine and a friend and a colleague. And he said, protect half the earth. And I always wanted to know which half. Where do we draw the lines? How do we determine this? For each country, can we show on a map where agriculture and cities can be and where the protected areas should be designated? I want the scientists to help us understand this. This obviously intersects very closely with the agriculture challenges. So ecologists and agronomists need to be working intimately together, because the biggest challenge to biodiversity is probably the agriculture sector. It's the extension of farmlands, croplands, pasture lands. It's the drainage of water for irrigation. Agriculture is the great driver of land use change and of unsustainability and biodiversity loss. And yet the agronomists and the conservationists tend to view each other as enemies rather than as colleagues for how to actually draw the right maps to say, here's what can be done here and here's what should not be done here. Now, suppose we had an ideal map of the world that identified where the reserves should be, where agriculture should be under different conditions, how the rivershed should be used, how the fisheries should be controlled, and so forth. Suppose we knew that by the magic of ecological sciences, we would then face the question, how could such a vision actually be implemented? Because it would not be consistent with market forces. Market forces would say, chop down those trees and grow palm oil, deforest and open up more pasture land, and so forth. So the incentive questions become very crucial. Once we know what to protect, then we need a structure how to protect them. Let me just observe that we do not have even a basic incentive structure for conservation almost anywhere in the world. There is almost no active valuation of ecosystem services. There is no funding to keep forests standing. There is very little enforcement of mechanisms like tradable quotas for fisheries. Forests are routinely chopped down, even when they are designated as reserved areas, because illegal logging is quite profitable typically. I was taken a few years ago in Borneo, in Kalimantan, to a protected region, and all I saw for 50 kilometers was trucks carrying out giant tropical logwoods on their way to the Chinese market. So it was completely being deforested, but in name, it was a protected area. So we need incentive structures and enforcement structures that don't exist. There are basically, there are several kinds of tools that in principle could be used. We could be paying communities to protect the nature, even paying indigenous communities, for example, to be active stewards and guardians of their ecosystems. We could be paying to keep land areas intact rather than utilized. But the funding for that barely exists at the international level in any scale. So we have demonstration projects, small scale projects, but we don't have anything like the scale of resources that would be needed for this kind of protection. Another kind of regulation is to enforce rules of sustainability within global supply chains. So a buyer of tropical logwoods would have to certify that the source of those logs is a sustainable source, or the purchaser of soybeans from Brazil would have to certify that the soybeans did not come from a deforested margin of the Amazon, and so forth. And Europe is trying to introduce such supply chain rules. They're very rudimentary, and most of the supply side countries, whether it's the Southeast Asian countries that provide palm oil, or whether it is the South American countries that provide feed grains and meat products, resist this kind of regulation. They don't want it, they don't like it. And so really implementing this kind of sustainable supply chain rule, I think, is promising, but very difficult. Then comes the enforcement issue. Almost any of these mechanisms is subject to cheating and subject to illegal activities. And in order to enforce such agreements, there needs to be policing, and there needs to be very active monitoring. I think one of the most important good points is that with satellite data, we can have daily monitoring. In fact, we can create real-time data on where deforestation is taking place, or where ships are where they should not be in fishery zones, and so on. So we have the capacity for monitoring that is much, much greater than it was ever before, because it can be done remotely and digitally. But still, we haven't implemented such systems in a detailed way. So maybe I'll pause here just to say we're running out of time. We need the scientists to say, here is what to do. Here are the rules that could actually be put in place. Then economists like myself can probably help by coming along and saying, here are incentive structures or regulations or financial mechanisms that can help to enforce what you, the conservation biologists, have identified as the substantive need in order to achieve the conservation goals that the world has set. Then, of course, we have the ultimate issue of trying to get the attention of our governments. For me, in the United States, this is especially hard because my government is especially nasty, I would say, incompetent and corrupt. And so it's rather difficult to get their attention because they're much more interested in war than they are in peace. And they're much more interested in unilateralism than they are in cooperation. But we have to try. So this is maybe where I'll stop and turn it back over to you for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Has been very, very, very comprehensive, and it's very enlightening to hear from someone who has been on the table on some of the key discussions for policy for such complex issues. So just to recap some of the key things that I found more relevant. So then the lack of alignment between institutions and this crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate, sustainable development. The fact that the conservation crisis is irreversible, I think that's something that many people don't grasp. And the fact that it's more complex than even climate change. So when I discuss with climate change people, they feel surprised when I tell them that climate change is one parameter. But in biodiversity, you have so many dynamics, and as you were pointing very correctly, at local scale. So that makes things very complex. But I think also that brings a high relevance to capacity building. I think something that in the conservation agenda has been pushed a lot is that you need to have qualified people capable to implement conservation everywhere. You cannot rely on external agents coming and making a quick judgment and telling what to do. So that means that education, training, exposure, all that facilitates local capacity is really, really important for conservation and at different levels, research, governance, implementation. Something very complex. You were saying that the market economies don't align with, that market economies do not incorporate the losses in natural capital. So basically all the externalities. And I will ask about this. and the difficulty to formulate policies that can work for conservation. So then I think the three, just to summarize in 3 words, is about planning properly, having the right incentives, and having monitoring and enforcing mechanisms to know that things happen, right? So then, yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming talking about these complex problems and understanding how difficult is the task. So I will just like to make a couple of questions, and then I will take the audience questions. So then in terms of the market incorporation of externalities, so then do you have any suggestion of how this could be done, how we can consider natural capital in our economic system?
Yeah, and in terms of market forces, this area does not lend itself to market-based solutions very well. When it comes to the energy transformation, for example, when we need to move from fossil fuels to zero carbon energy sources, the idea of a carbon tax or a tradable permit for emissions is a kind of policy that is useful. I think it's exaggerated in its use, but it's an example of a market-based instrument. When it comes to biological conservation, it's much harder to simply put a price on these things. And so the kind of policies that are more relevant are actually kind of zoning policies, that here is a protected area, and in this area, you're not allowed to do the following. You cannot chop down the trees. There cannot be new plantations. So these are more quantitative and regulatory limits than market-based systems. There is an attempt to use market-based instruments indirectly, for example, the carbon offset market, the idea that people or communities or smallholder farmers are paid to store carbon biologically by keeping forests intact, for example, or restoring degraded land, and they're given some kind of contract to do that. Economists like that. I'm not against it, but it's harder than it looks. And I don't believe in the voluntary carbon market very much. When the term voluntary is used, it's mainly by the United States and mainly to avoid responsibility. So the US government likes market solutions because it doesn't like regulatory approaches. And I find that approach not very convincing when it comes to protected land areas. So I would like more of a kind of map that defines in each region what is permitted and what is not permitted, but based on good ecology. Because the ecologists can tell us, here are hotspots, or here we need the contiguous area protected at the following scale. And so don't interfere with this biome. That clarity, I think, is probably needed more to tell the markets, do not go further. And also when it comes to deforestation or afforestation, I read this literature with a lot of confusion on my side, because there's even a big debate in general. Is reforesting really helpful here? Is it the right kind of species? Is it going to is it going to wreck the hydrological cycle? Is it actually going to lead to a reduction of biodiversity rather than true biodiversity conservation? Is the Great Green Wall in Africa a good idea? Is it a slogan? Is it realistic? I don't know, because as I read the scientific literature, I read all sorts of things, and since I'm not a conservation biologist, I actually don't know the answers to these things when I see the contradictions to them. So I don't believe, what I do believe is money makes a difference. In the coming year, I will be working directly with the Brazilians who will be who are the presidents of the G20 this year and will be hosting COP30 next year. And they are planning a major fund for tropical forests, for tropical forest conservation. So, of course, the Brazilians are interested in the Amazon conservation. They have reached out to the Congo Basin countries in Africa, and especially to the Southeast Asian countries across Malaysia, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, and Vietnam to have a protected tropical forest cooperative policy and a global fund to pay local communities, for example, to protect their forests from deforestation. So that kind of incentive, I think, makes sense, but it's not quite a market instrument. It's actually, it's a little bit like a market instrument, but it's mainly paying local communities or regions for preserving their ecosystems with the rich countries putting up the funding. So that is one kind of area where probably we could think about this incentive structure.
Yeah, thank you very much. For the sake of time, I will just pass to the audience questions. Professor, are you okay to go 15 minutes
Sure.
more until okay, yeah. So, and just to let you know, we have around 2,002 people online watching the webinar. And we have a question by Bill Patton. I think you know Bill.
Yes.
Yeah. So then among your many accomplishments are a number of world-changing institutional improvements, such as the MDGs, now SDGs, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and TB, and more recently, the addition to the AU to the G20. You emphasize some of the things we discussed before about the lack of alignment in institutions and to protect biodiversity. So the question is, do you recommend an institutional innovation to achieve those things, to achieve what we have been discussing? Is there any idea of how we can innovate on the institutional side?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, China is very outward oriented now, especially with initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, which I very much like and very much applaud. The Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative to build 21st century infrastructure, rail, roads, fiber, and so forth, to connect the world economy. I emphasize always that we need to green the BRI. We need to make sure that the Belt and Road Initiative is institutionally focused on a green economy. Now, there is a Green Belt and Road Institute, and I was happy to visit it in Beijing just about 8 weeks ago. It is focused significantly on low carbon energy systems, so the energy transformation. But it also could be focused on the conservation issues. And so bringing the conservation issues into BRI would be a kind of institutional upgrading that I think would be very, very significant. In general, China's reach is so large that when the government and the NDRC gets the idea that this should be a focus, it makes a huge difference globally. You know, China's demand also for primary commodities is so significant that China is a major factor in the global supply chains. It's a major factor in tropical products, especially tropical hardwoods. It's a major driver of species extinction because of traditional Chinese medicines and rhinoceros horns and other things that are quite exotic, but are leading to a massive amount of harvesting of species that are at threat right now. We need to incorporate these considerations into Chinese planning and practice because the government is interested in them, but it requires an upgrading of attention. So this is one area where I would like to put the focus. And my experience is that there's a very good resonance. I argued a few years ago, take coal out of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I wasn't the only one arguing this, but I raised my voice for that. And indeed, coal projects were removed from the Belt and Road Initiative. And we can do the same on the conservation side. So this is one area that I think would be quite important. I mentioned a second initiative that I'm very much involved in, and that is trying to bring the major tropical forest regions together. There actually are about 70 countries that have subtropical forests in them. Of course, we have three major regions, the Amazon region, the Congo Basin region, and the Southeast Asian region. One thing I'm trying to do is to create science panels for each of these three regions where scientists can take the lead in telling the presidents and policymakers, here's what needs to be done. We have a science panel for the Amazon, which has engaged about 200 of the leading Amazon ecologists and climatologists and hydrologists, and they've done a wonderful job of giving a state-of-the-art assessment of the Amazon. And incidentally, their conclusion is that the Amazon is right on the edge of a tipping point that could lead to catastrophic drying of the Amazon. In the Congo Basin, there is nothing like this. So we're trying to put together a science panel of Congo Basin specialists. And in Southeast Asia, we have started with Borneo, with the island of, with Kalimantan, and trying to bring together the local scientists. And as we've been saying, there is no substitute for local expertise. The rest of the world will never save your ecosystem. The only ones that can save the ecosystem are the local scientists that understand the ecosystem and care about it, but they need to have the attention of the policymakers. So this is where I'm trying to help through the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network to do whatever I can to help raise the voices of the scientific community in each protected biome so that they can say to their presidents or prime ministers, we are at threat, here is why we are at threat, and here is what needs to be done. And I think it can make a difference. And as I said, by next year at COP30 in Belém in November 2025, we're hoping to unveil a tens of billions of dollars tropical agriculture fund that will help countries with funding to put in place local solutions. And so I'm hoping that this will get started by next year.
I think I was very pleased to hear about BRI. I also believe that the BRI is a great opportunity to achieve conservation goals. And some colleagues and I have been working on that. And I personally work for something called the Southeast Asia Biodiversity Research Institute.
Fantastic.
That could help with some of these things, and
Yeah.
you know, we can follow up because we have interest in working with you know, throughout the region and move from science to policy. So maybe at some point I might message you separately to see if there's any opportunity there.
Wonderful. And let me say to you and to everybody, my email address is sachs@columbia.edu, SACHS@columbia.edu. Please feel free to write with ideas and suggestions. Where I can help usually is bringing these issues to the attention of national leaders or regional leaders. But I need the scientists to say what needs to be to the attention, because I can't do that. But just in the next few weeks, I will be meeting with I'll be meeting with I won't name names, but the two heads of state in the ASEAN region talking about sustainable development for the Southeast Asian countries. So it's a great opportunity to say, here is what needs to be done, or to even propose, here is the research that needs to be undertaken urgently to know what needs to be done. And that I can help with.
Yeah. Well, based on what you were talking in your opening statement, I will argue that the science of optimizing and finding where is the best way to protect biodiversity is not the difficult part. I mean, those things we do have increasing amount of data, and we have models that can optimize based on different goals. So what, as a conservation scientist, what I see is really difficult to move into the implementation because all the trade-offs that are involved. So then we know where is the best rainforest, but we know also there are local communities aiming to have some development objectives, and there are different conflicts, different stakeholders. So the issues related to trade-offs with people, plus representation issues between countries. So then maybe one country prioritize something, but it's in a broader scale is not so important. So there are issues that we are in a point in which the data has improved a lot, and I think that's a great sign. But the jump from making a model to think about how it can be implemented in the real world is really complicated and scary for scientists.
But it's interesting. For me, it's exactly the opposite, because I understand an economic model, for example, the energy sector transformation. And I've done a lot of leadership of modeling teams to talk about the pathway to decarbonized energy systems. Because basically you're replacing coal-fired power plants with alternatives, intermittent wind and solar and storage. And it's a matter of specifying what the energy system looks like, or the power grid looks like. But when it comes to conservation, for me, it's more of a mystery, because it's very spatial, it's very interconnected. I don't know the models myself intrinsically of again, as I said with Edward Wilson, which half of the world, how would you identify? But if you can come up with that, I'm not bad at coming up with how to make the connections with the planning ministries, the prime ministers, the finance ministers. If we had a clear picture, or a clearer picture of here's what needs to be protected where, I think designing the incentives or the regulatory structure to get that done would be feasible on my part, or the kinds of tools that I know. But what I don't know is how to say effectively, this is a biodiversity hotspot, and here is how to address it from an ecological point of view. And please make sure to keep these corridors open, and there must be this scale of land because we have this these trophic levels, and we have this we need X hundred square kilometers here of protected area. That kind of information from the ecologists would be invaluable.
Yeah. So I will make just one final question. We have many questions, many good questions from the audience. I'm sorry, we will not have time to address all of them. So I will finish with one question by Prof. Yuan, that was our previous speaker in this series. And she has been doing really good work on the planning that we are discussing right now, and spatial planning and thinking about different trade-offs, including not only protection, but also restoration, which I think is a very important thing. And she makes 2 points. One is that I think what I was saying before, that the models exist, the difficulty is moving into the policy pipeline. Unless the models either exist or can be generated, is not the challenging part. So she's asking, have you seen real-world examples that make you hopeful of the pathways you just suggested? This means scientifically informed interventions needed, like land use plans, economic solutions to make the interventions happen, the policy implementation of the solution at scale. If not, what makes you hopeful, if you are indeed hopeful about this issue?
I've seen solutions in different areas, so it's a little hard to generalize. And of course, there are spatial solutions and protected regions that you know about better than I do. What I've seen in the last 2 years with the Amazon is that when we had this science panel, and it was led by Carlos Nobre, who was a wonderful and renowned scientist who inspired hundreds of younger scientists to devote their time to this effort. President Lula and the other presidents of the region took note, because here suddenly was a report by the region scientists that was very compelling and very frightening also. It talked about 17% deforestation, 17% degraded land, 34% loss of effective ecosystem functioning, and an argument why that was very close to the tipping point of turning the Amazon from a carbon sink to a carbon source. Now, I'm watching that play out now with the Brazilian government very interested, and because of COP30, taking the lead to actually try to implement now an improved set of policies. And the National Development Bank, BNDES, based in Rio, is working on these mechanisms and what a forestry fund, how it could be structured and how it should look. So it's hard work. It's really hard work. Governments are not used to this. These are issues that they are not very comfortable with. Governments know something about a national park. They know something about protecting a tourist area. They have come to know something about the fisheries, but they don't understand operationally more complex ecological challenges and ecosystem functioning challenges. And so I can't say that there's vast proof of this approach. I just can't think of another one. I believe we need to lead with the science and the evidence, and then we need to reach the top policymakers and tell them the truth. Your economy, your society is at dire risk for the following reasons, and these are things that need to be done. And then from there, open up the policy space to work through this, where the scientists, the economists, the public officials are jointly engaged in a complex problem-solving approach. I believe it can work because I know from experience in other areas, public health and other areas, that an evidence-based approach can work. Once we have, and so that, again, I think we must do. I never think about whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I just think that it's urgent that we do this as fast as possible.
So yes, I wanted to finalize by asking you in a very short answer. So are you optimistic, pessimistic, neither, possibly?
Yeah, as I say, I don't. want to do is keep the focus on what we need to do. Today, I was with the Prime Minister in the Caribbean and the Deputy Secretary General of the UN in a 3-hour brainstorming, especially about financing the climate agenda. And it's very heartening. A lot of high-level attention, a lot of detailed work. This is Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. She comes from a small country, but she is extremely intelligent and determined. And because she's a national leader, she has a voice that reaches the other national leaders. And so we spent 3 hours today, and this was not the first time, on a very detailed discussion of the what to do's. And it was real problem solving and a number of experts adding different perspectives, but very, very fruitful. We need to do this with the biodiversity conservation in the same way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I know it's very late in New York right now, so I really appreciate your willingness to talk with us at this time.
Of course.
I think it's been very comprehensive and very enlightening discussion with a lot of topics and addressing the complexities, but we need to be very clear about this. And just to let you know, more than 2,000 people were following the webinar. If you are able, will be posted on Bilibili and YouTube, because all these people will continue to have access to this information. And yeah, yes. I'm hoping that we have more discussions between different sectors, the development sector, the conservation sector. As you were saying, is the interdisciplinarity, what is going to drive how things are being implemented. So I'm very pleased.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And please come back to me, sachs@columbia.edu, with ideas and proposals and next meetings.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.